Chapter 9. Elizabeth in Derbyshire. During the week before the regiment's departure, all the young ladies in the Meryton area became extremely depressed. Only the two elder Miss Bennets were still able to eat, drink, sleep, and lead a normal life. They were often scolded by Kitty and Lydia, who could not understand such hard-heartedness.
"How shall we manage without the officers?" they cried miserably. "How can you smile like that, Lizzie?"
Their affectionate mother shared all their sadness.
"I remember when Colonel Miller's regiment went away 25 years ago," she said. "I thought my heart was broken." "I'm sure mine will be broken," said Lydia. "If we could only go to Brighton," said Mrs. Bennet. "I'm certain a little sea-bathing would be good for me." "Oh, yes, but Papa is so disagreeable about it."
Elizabeth tried not to listen, but could not help seeing the justice of Darcy's objections to her family. But soon Lydia's bitterness changed to absolute delight when she received an invitation from Colonel Forster's wife to accompany her to Brighton with the regiment. Mrs. Forster was a very young woman, only recently married, and as cheerful and sociable as Lydia, with whom she had been friendly for 2 months. Poor Kitty was very upset at not being included in the invitation, but Lydia cared nothing for her sister's feelings. She ran wildly through the house, calling for everyone's congratulations, and laughing and talking more loudly than ever. Elizabeth could not share her sister's happiness, and felt it was her duty to advise her father secretly to refuse permission for Lydia to go. But she could not convince him that Lydia would be in any real danger, and so all the arrangements were made for her sister's departure. Elizabeth thought her father was wrong, however, and was still worried about how Lydia would behave in an atmosphere of greater freedom and among the temptations of a fashionable seaside town like Brighton. Elizabeth had seen Mr. Wickham regularly since her return from Kent, at family parties and visits. She no longer thought him so agreeable. As the rich Miss King had left Meryton to stay with her uncle, Mr. Wickham appeared eager to transfer his affections back to Elizabeth. His confidence in his own charm and ability to please annoyed Elizabeth very much, so that when she met him for the last time before the regiment's departure, she spoke quite coldly to him. In reply to a polite question of his about her Hunsford visit, she could not stop herself mentioning her frequent meetings with Mr. Darcy, and her favourable opinion of that gentleman's character. Wickham looked a little embarrassed, and made no further attempt to charm Elizabeth. They separated at last with mutual politeness, and possibly a mutual desire never to meet again. When Lydia left for Brighton, Elizabeth had to put up with Mrs. Bennet's and Kitty's constant complaints that Longbourn had become very dull. Fortunately, she was able to look forward to a trip which she would soon be taking with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. They had planned to visit the Lake District, but Mrs. Gardiner had recently written to say that as her husband's business made it necessary to shorten their holiday to 3 weeks, they would not have time to visit the whole of the Lake District comfortably. Instead, she suggested visiting Derbyshire, an area with a particularly strong attraction for her, as she had spent a large part of her early life there. Elizabeth was disappointed, but accepted the new plan at once. Although it was impossible to hear of Derbyshire without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, she felt sure she could avoid meeting Mr. Darcy there. 4 weeks later, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner arrived at Longbourn, where they had arranged to leave their children in Jane's care. The next day they set out with Elizabeth on their journey. The 3 of them made excellent travelling companions, sharing an intelligent interest in the people and places they saw on their way, and a strong affection for each other. After visiting Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, and Birmingham, they arrived in Derbyshire, and decided to stay in the small town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had lived before her marriage. Elizabeth discovered that Mr. Darcy's house, Pemberley, was only 8 kilometres away from Lambton. "I often used to go to Pemberley when I was younger," said Mrs. Gardner. "Wouldn't you like to see it, Lizzie? We could go tomorrow. It's a beautiful place. Wickham spent his youth there, you know." I am rather tired of large country houses, Aunt," said Elizabeth, forced to pretend. How dreadful it would be to meet Mr. Darcy while viewing his house. But when she asked a servant at the hotel 1 or 2 careful questions that evening, she was told that Mr. Darcy was not at home at the moment. Greatly relieved, she felt able to agree to her aunt's suggestion when it was repeated the next morning, and Mr. Gardner ordered a carriage immediately. In a short time, they entered the gates of Pemberley Park and drove through an extensive and beautiful wood. At the top of a hill, they had their first view of Pemberley House, situated on the other side of a valley, with a line of high wooded hills behind. The house was a large, handsome stone building, which appeared to fit naturally into the scenery. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner were warm in their admiration, and Elizabeth was delighted. At that moment, she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be worthwhile. They drove up to the front door and asked to be allowed to visit the house. The Pemberley housekeeper, a respectable elderly woman, showed them round. All the rooms were of a good size and elegantly yet sensibly furnished. From every window there was an attractive view. Elizabeth began to admire the owner's taste in everything she saw. And I might have been mistress of this place, she thought. Instead of viewing these rooms as a stranger, I might be welcoming my uncle and aunt as visitors. But no, she suddenly remembered, that could never be. I wouldn't have been able to invite my uncle and aunt, or any other of my vulgar family connections. This was a lucky thought, which saved her from something like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master were really absent, but luckily her uncle asked the question instead. It was quite alarming to hear that Mr. Darcy was expected to arrive the next day with a large group of friends. How glad Elizabeth was that their own journey had not been delayed a day. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner were enjoying their conversation with the housekeeper, who seemed content to talk about her master. "Mr. Darcy is a very handsome gentleman, as you will see from the painting upstairs. His sister is most attractive too, and so accomplished. She plays and sings the whole day. My master has just sent a new piano from London for her. He's such a kind brother. He'll do anything for Miss Georgiana." "Does Mr. Darcy spend much time at Pemberley?" asked Mr. Gardner. "Not as much as I'd like, sir." "If your master married, he might spend more time here." "Yes, sir, but I don't know when that'll be. I don't know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardner smiled, and Elizabeth listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper continued. "It's no more than the truth. Everybody who knows him says the same. He's never spoken a cross word to me, and I've known him since he was a baby. Some people call him proud, but I've never seen any of that. He's the best master that ever lived." Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? She wondered. This was the most extraordinary praise for the man she had always thought so disagreeable and proud, especially with people he considered inferior to himself. She longed to hear more, but now the housekeeper was leading them upstairs. Soon Elizabeth found herself in front of the painting of Mr. Darcy. He was smiling at her, just as she remembered him smiling sometimes when he looked at her. She looked at the picture silently for several minutes before going downstairs with the others. At that moment, Elizabeth certainly felt more warmly towards Mr. Darcy than at any time since their first meeting. She was beginning to realize that she had underestimated his character. His housekeeper's opinion of him was totally favorable, and what praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As she stood in front of his picture, she gratefully remembered the warmth of his feelings for her, and began to forget the way in which he had expressed them. As they had now seen all the rooms which were open to the public, the housekeeper called the gardener, who was going to show them the park and gardens. They were just walking away from the house when Elizabeth turned to have one last look, and saw the owner of Pemberley come suddenly forward from behind the house. They were within 20 metres of each other, and Elizabeth could not avoid his seeing her. Their eyes instantly met, and they both blushed. He appeared very surprised, but recovering quickly, approached and spoke to Elizabeth, if not calmly, at least with perfect politeness. Astonished and confused, she received his greetings with embarrassment. Soon he could find no more to say, and left her to return to the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, who had been watching from a distance, expressed their admiration of his appearance, but Elizabeth could only think of her feelings. How unfortunate that she had come! She blushed again. It might seem as if she had planned this meeting with him, and his behaviour was so different. Never before had she heard him speak so politely and so gently. What could it mean? Her head full of these thoughts, she joined her uncle and aunt in their walk through the gardens. They were walking slowly beside an attractive stream, when they noticed Mr. Darcy coming towards them. This time Elizabeth was able to control herself better, and she returned his greetings politely. She hid a smile when he asked her to do him the honour of introducing him to her friends, as she felt sure he was not expecting the well-mannered gardeners to be some of her low-born relations. He certainly seemed surprised when she introduced her uncle and aunt, but took care to talk for some time to Mr. Gardner with every appearance of interest. Elizabeth was delighted that these relations at least could not be criticised for their poor behaviour or lack of intelligence. On their way back to the house, Mr. Darcy walked beside Elizabeth. There was a short silence before she spoke. "Your housekeeper informed us you would not arrive until tomorrow, so I had not expected to find you here."
"It is true. I came early on business. The rest of the party will be here tomorrow. Among them are Mr. Bingley and his sisters, whom you know," he continued after a pause. "And there is one other person who particularly wishes to meet you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you?" Surprised, but flattered by this great compliment, Elizabeth gave her permission. When they arrived at the house, Mr. Darcy offered them some refreshment, but they politely refused. Mr. Darcy helped the ladies into the carriage, and as it drove away from Pemberley, Elizabeth watched him walking slowly back towards the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner were loud in their praise of him, but Elizabeth said very little. The very next morning, Mr. Darcy brought his sister to visit Elizabeth and the Gardners at the hotel in Lambton. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner were astonished by the honour they were receiving, but Elizabeth's obvious embarrassment and Darcy's haste in making the visit so immediately soon provided them with an explanation. They observed their niece and Darcy carefully during the visit, and could not doubt that the gentleman was in love, although they were not certain of the lady's feelings. Elizabeth was delighted to discover that Georgiana Darcy, far from being proud, as Wickham had said, was just very shy, with quiet, gentle manners. It was clear that she greatly admired her brother, and had every intention of liking Miss Bennet, as Darcy had spoken of her so favourably. Elizabeth was also satisfied to see that Bingley, who was with the Darcys, did not seem particularly interested in Georgiana, in spite of Caroline Bingley's wishes, and she had to admit that she had never seen Mr. Darcy behaving so sociably and pleasantly, not only to herself, but also to the relations to whom he had referred with such disdain during that last conversation in Hunsford Rectory. Elizabeth herself was more than usually anxious to make herself agreeable to everybody, and she succeeded, because Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. Miss Darcy, encouraged by her brother, invited Elizabeth and the Gardners to dinner at Pemberley in 2 days' time, and when this invitation had been accepted, The Darcys and Mr. Bingley left, with many warm expressions of politeness on both sides. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were very curious about their niece's feelings for Mr. Darcy, but were careful not to question her. That evening, Elizabeth lay awake for 2 whole hours, trying to understand how she felt about him. She now thought of him with respect and a certain admiration, and was deeply grateful to him, not only for having once loved her, but for still loving her enough to forgive her bitter rejection of him, as well as all her unjust accusations. The change she had noticed, in a man who was once so proud, must be caused by his love for her. Now, since she was almost sure that if she wanted, she could encourage him to propose to her again, she only had to decide how far she wished to be involved in his future happiness, in which she already felt a real interest. Chapter 10. Lydia and Wickham. On the 3rd morning of her visit to Lambton, Elizabeth received 2 letters from Jane. The first had been badly addressed and sent elsewhere, then redirected. Her aunt and uncle were out walking, so she sat down to read them at once. The first had been written 5 days before, and started just as expected, with a description of Longbourn dinner parties and visits. But the second half of this letter was dated a day later, and was evidently written in a great hurry. This is what it said. Since writing the above, dear Lizzie, something most unexpected and serious has happened, but I do not wish to alarm you. We are all well. It concerns poor Lydia. An express letter came at midnight last night, when we were all in bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she had run away to Scotland with one of his officers, with Wickham, in fact. There, of course, she can marry without her parents' approval. Imagine our surprise. What a foolish marriage for both of them! But at least he is not interested in her money, as he must know my father can give her almost nothing. Kitty admits that she knew about Lydia's attachment to Wickham from Lydia's letters. Our poor mother is very upset. I must finish now, as I cannot stay away from her for long. I hope you can read this. I hardly know what I have written. Without allowing herself time to think, Elizabeth opened the second letter, dated a day later, and read impatiently, "My dearest sister, I am so confused I cannot write properly. I have bad news for you. Foolish though a marriage between Mr. Wickham and our poor Lydia might be, we are now only too anxious to hear that it has taken place. There is reason to fear they have not gone to Scotland. Colonel Forster arrived here yesterday. He tells us that one of the officers, a close friend of Wickham, believes that Wickham never intended to go to Scotland or to marry Lydia at all. The Colonel followed the couple as far as London, but they have not been seen leaving the capital. Our anxiety, my dear Lizzie, is very great. My father and mother believe the worst, and the Colonel fears Wickham is not a man to be trusted. But I cannot believe him to be so wicked. And is Lydia so completely lacking in morals that she could live with a man without being married? Impossible. Now my poor mother is really ill. My father is angry, for perhaps the first time in his life, and Kitty is being scolded for keeping the attachment a secret. While I am glad, dearest Lizzie, that you have been spared some of the confusion and worry we have been experiencing, I cannot help begging you all to come home as soon as possible. My father is going to London with the Colonel to try to find Lydia. I think he is too upset to achieve results in the best and safest way, and my uncle's advice and help would be everything in the world. I rely on his goodness."
"Oh, where is my uncle?"
cried Elizabeth, running to the door. But just as she reached it, Mr. Darcy came in. Her pale face and strange manner prevented him from speaking, and she, who could think of nothing except Lydia, said hurriedly,
"Excuse me, but I must leave you. I must find Mr. Gardiner immediately. There is not a moment to lose."
"Good God! What is the matter?" he cried.
then added, "Let me, or let the servant, go to find Mr. and Mrs. Gardner. You are not well enough. You cannot go yourself." Elizabeth hesitated, but her legs were trembling and she realized he was right. After giving the servant her message, she sat down, looking so ill that Darcy could not leave her or stop himself, saying gently, "Let me call someone to look after you. Shall I get you a glass of wine? You are very ill."
"No, thank you," she replied. "I am quite well. I am only upset by some dreadful news I've just received from Longbourn."
She burst into tears, and for a few minutes could not speak another word. Darcy watched her miserably in sympathetic silence. At last she spoke again.
"It cannot be hidden from anyone. My youngest sister has eloped with Mr. Wickham. You know him too well to doubt what will happen. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to marry her. She is lost forever, and I could have prevented it. I knew how bad his character was. If only I had told my family what I knew about him. But it is all too late now."
Darcy looked at her in astonishment. "I am shocked," he said, "and sad, very sad. What has been done to find her and bring her back?"
"My father has gone to London, and I hope my uncle will go too. We shall leave Lambton, I hope, in half an hour. But I know very well that nothing can be done. How can such a man be persuaded? How can we even find them? I have not the smallest hope. It is horrible."
Darcy made no answer. He was walking up and down with a serious, thoughtful expression on his face. Elizabeth soon observed and instantly understood it. She was losing her influence over him. This proof of moral weakness in her family was driving him away from her. Never before had she so honestly believed she could have loved him, as now, when mutual affection must be impossible. But she could not think for long of herself, when Lydia's situation was so desperate. Mr. Darcy left almost immediately, politely regretting that Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle would not, in the circumstances, be able to come to dinner at Pemberley that day, and again expressing his sympathy. When Mr. and Mrs. Gardner entered the room, Elizabeth hurriedly explained everything to them, and was greatly relieved when they agreed to leave at once to return to Longbourn. Their packing was done at great speed, and soon they were in the carriage, driving south.
"Lizzie,"
began Mrs. Gardner,
"I cannot believe that Wickham's character is so bad that he would run away with Lydia and not marry her. Do you really think he is capable of that?"
"My dear aunt, Jane and I both know that he has neither honesty nor honour. He has falsely accused Mr. Darcy, and has lied wickedly about the whole Darcy family. You saw what a shy, gentle girl Miss Darcy is, but he had described her as proud, disagreeable, and disdainful."
"But does Lydia know nothing of this?"
"Oh, no, that is the worst of all. I didn't know the truth myself until my visit to Kent, and when I returned and told Jane, she and I decided not to make our knowledge public. Now I know that was a mistake. I never thought that Lydia could be in any danger from him." When they arrived at Longbourn, Elizabeth and her aunt were able to help Jane in looking after the children. They also attempted to calm Mrs. Bennet, who, however, refused to be calmed, and blamed everyone except herself for the disaster.
"If only I had been allowed to take the family to Brighton, this would not have happened. Poor dear Lydia had no one to take care of her. Why did those Forsters ever let her go out of their sight? I am sure they neglected her. Of course, I did not want her to go to Brighton, but nobody took any notice of me as usual. And now Mr. Bennet has gone to London, and I'm sure he'll fight Wickham, and then out of the house before he's cold in his grave."
"Do not worry, sister," said Mr. Gardner kindly. "I'm going to London tomorrow to help my brother-in-law."
"Oh, thank you, my dear brother," replied Mrs. Bennet. "Make sure you find Lydia and Wickham, and if they are not married yet, make them marry. And tell Lydia they mustn't wait for wedding clothes, but she shall have as much money as she wants to buy them after they are married. And keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him what a dreadful state I am in, so ill that I can get no rest by night or by day. And tell Lydia not to buy any clothes until she's seen me, because she doesn't know the best shops. Oh, brother, how kind you are! I hope you will manage everything."
The next day, Mr. Gardner travelled to London as he had promised. Now began a painful period of waiting for those left at Longbourn. They became even more anxious as news came from Meryton of Wickham's lies, debts, and secret attachments to most of the servant girls in the town. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world, and protested that they had always distrusted his great charm and appearance of goodness. Although Elizabeth did not believe half of these stories, she believed enough to feel sure that her sister's reputation was already lost, and even Jane almost despaired of receiving good news. In a few days' time, they were relieved to receive a letter from Mr. Gardner, but unfortunately it only informed them that Wickham and Lydia had not yet been found. Apparently, Wickham had left gambling debts of over £1,000 behind him in Brighton. Mr. Bennet was returning home the following day, leaving his brother-in-law in London to continue the search. When she heard this, Mrs. Bennet did not show as much satisfaction as her children expected, considering the anxiety she had previously expressed for her husband's safety.
"What? Is he coming home without poor Lydia?" she cried. "And who will fight Wickham and make him marry her?"
Mrs. Gardner took the opportunity of Mr. Bennet's return to go back to London herself with her children. She was still longing to know how Elizabeth's relationship with Darcy had developed, but Elizabeth had not once mentioned his name, so her aunt did not dare to ask any direct questions. When Mr. Bennet arrived home, he appeared as calm as ever, but in a conversation with Elizabeth he admitted that he felt to blame for Lydia's elopement. "I know I should have had more control over her," he said. "And, Lizzie, you were right. I should never have let her go to Brighton." Kitty, who was listening, said,
"Papa, if I ever went to Brighton, I'd behave much better than Lydia has done."
"You go to Brighton?" cried her father. "I would not trust you within 20 kilometres of the place for £50. No, Kitty, I have at last learned to be cautious, and you will feel the effects of it. No officer may ever enter the house again, or even pass through the village, and balls will be absolutely forbidden unless you dance only with your sisters." Kitty, taking these threats seriously, began to cry. "Well, well," said he, "don't make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, I'll take you to the theatre at the end of that time." 2 days later, the news for which they had all been waiting so anxiously arrived. Mr. Gardner's letter informed them that Wickham and Lydia had been found, but that they were not married. However, certain financial arrangements had been made with Wickham. Mr. Bennet was asked to pay Lydia £100 a year, as well as arranging for her to inherit her equal share of the £5,000 which the Bennet girls would inherit after their parents' death. If these reasonable conditions were agreed, Wickham had promised to marry Lydia. At first, Elizabeth and Jane were delighted that their sister's reputation would be saved through marriage, even to such a man as Wickham. But then their father explained that Wickham would never have agreed to marry Lydia unless he had been paid a considerable amount of money immediately. They began to worry that it would be difficult to repay Mr. Gardner, who must have bribed Wickham in this way. Mrs. Bennet, however, had no such worries.
"He is her own uncle after all," she cried happily. "Why shouldn't he pay? My dear, dear Lydia, married at 16. How I long to see her, and dear Wickham too. But the wedding clothes! I'll write to my sister-in-law about them at once. I'm so happy. In a short time I'll have a daughter married. Oh, Mrs. Wickham, how well it sounds!"
Now that Lydia was going to be married, Elizabeth greatly regretted telling Darcy of her fears for her sister. But even if Lydia had been married in the most honourable way, it was extremely unlikely that Mr. Darcy would wish to connect himself with a family in which there was a close relationship with Wickham, the man he most justly disliked. She could not expect him to go on caring for her, as she felt certain he had done when they met in Derbyshire. But now that she was sure he could not love her, she was convinced they could have been happy together. He seemed to be exactly the man who would have suited her. They could have usefully influenced each other. His mind might have been softened, and his manners improved by her sociability, and she might have learnt from his greater judgment and knowledge of the world. But no such relationship could now teach an admiring world what happiness in marriage was really like. Instead, Wickham would marry Lydia, with little chance of happiness for either of them. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner had arranged for Lydia to be married quietly in London from their house. At first, Mr. Bennet had refused to allow his youngest daughter ever to enter his house again, but eventually Jane and Elizabeth persuaded him to receive Lydia and her husband after the wedding. It would only be a short visit, as almost immediately she and Wickham would be moving north to Newcastle, where he had accepted a new army post. When the carriage containing the young couple arrived at Longbourn House, the two elder Bennet sisters were shocked to see how unashamed Lydia was. She entered the house, laughing and joking, and asked all her sisters to congratulate her. Wickham was no more embarrassed than she was, and spoke to everyone in his usual flattering, agreeable manner. They seemed to have no idea of the anxiety they had caused by their shameless and wicked behaviour. Elizabeth was quite disgusted by their relaxed, confident appearance, and determined not to show any interest when Lydia insisted on describing every detail of her wedding day. She could not help reacting with astonishment, however, when Lydia let slip the name of Mr. Darcy. He had apparently been present at the ceremony. Why would Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth wondered, attend the wedding of two people he must hold in the greatest contempt? She could not discover the reason from Lydia, who suddenly remembered it was supposed to be a secret, and she could not rest without knowing the truth. So she hurriedly sent a note to her aunt in London, asking urgently for an explanation.